December 18, 1944. The Ardennes forests lay buried beneath a crust of snow that shimmered silver under a pale, cold sun. The frozen wind slashed across the mud-choked roads leading to the makeshift American encampments. Inside a temporary field kitchen, the air steamed with the scent of roasting coffee and simmering stew, mingling with the acrid tang of diesel engines from nearby trucks. Every footstep on the icy ground rang sharp, echoing between the pocked trees like gunfire. Corporal James Riker crouched by a portable stove, his gloved hands maneuvering a can opener with precise, practiced movements. The soft hiss of heating elements was almost drowned out by the distant rumble of artillery, but the tension never eased. Around him, men shuffled in wool coats, boots crunching through frost, each carrying crates of canned goods and insulated packets. The snow reflected back a cold light, making the metal of mess tins and stoves glint like distant flares. From the tree line, German prisoners of war emerged, stumbling through the snow in ragged uniforms. They had been captured hours earlier, exhausted, frozen, and hungry. Their eyes widened as they took in the organized chaos of the American camp. The smell hit them first, coffee thick and steaming, the faint sweetness of chocolate, the sharp tang of preserved fruit. One soldier, barely able to keep his footing on the ice, reached instinctively for his stomach, and then froze, caught in disbelief. A truck rolled up, its engine clattering, and men leapt to unload wooden crates stamped with U.S. insignia. Inside, rows of pre-cooked meals sat in neat, metal trays, beef stew, potatoes, dried fruit bars, packets of instant cocoa. Each crate contained small disposable heaters that hissed as they warmed the rations, a luxury utterly foreign to the starving Wehrmacht. The soldiers moved with synchronized efficiency, the cold air punctuated by the rhythmic clang of metal against wood. Snowflakes clung to their eyelashes, shimmering in the weak sunlight as they worked. One POW stepped closer, his boots leaving thin tracks in the frost. He studied a man stirring a can of stew, the steam curling up like a phantom. The American soldier looked up briefly, wiping his brow with a gloved hand, then returned to his task. The German soldier's lips parted as he realized the simple, terrifying fact: these men were fed, warm, and alert. Around him, others began to murmur among themselves, voices low, heavy with disbelief. They had been trained to believe that the Americans were hardy but lean, that their rations were nothing more than scraps. Here, in the biting cold of Ardennes winter, those assumptions shattered. Riker distributed trays to men in line, who balanced them carefully over boots caked in mud and frost. A faint metallic clatter marked the opening of tin cans, a whisper of relief as hot liquid spilled onto hands, immediately absorbed into gloves. The POWs watched silently, their movements hesitant, as though any sudden motion might break the spell. One German soldier bent slightly forward, inhaling the aroma of coffee, and for a brief second, the war outside the perimeter vanished. The wind tore across the clearing, carrying echoes of distant artillery, punctuated by the rhythmic pulse of a nearby radar truck. Smoke from stoves drifted in lazy spirals, curling toward the grey sky. Snowflakes melted on steaming metal, hissing softly. Every sound was amplified: a dropped spoon, the scraping of tin against a crate, the distant howl of a shell, all threaded into a tension that seemed to press against the chest. The POW's eyes flicked between the moving figures, the trays, the heaters that hissed like tiny furnaces. None had ever imagined an army could feed itself, and its enemies, with such mechanical, precise abundance. Riker's hands moved without hesitation, scooping stew into bowls, tearing open packets of chocolate, setting aside packets of coffee. He glanced briefly at the men awaiting their rations, noting the faint smiles, the shivering bodies. A low murmur of approval rose, barely audible, blending with the distant roar of artillery. The German prisoners shifted, restless, unsure if this was a trap, a trick, or a glimpse of reality too cruel to grasp. The snow pressed down around them, silent witness to the unfolding revelation. One of the POWs, a tall man with a streak of frost on his cheek, knelt near a crate and gingerly lifted a disposable heater. The metal casing hissed and steamed in his hands. He froze, staring at it as if it were a weapon. The others gathered slowly, circling the small, glowing boxes. Their training had taught them resilience, endurance, and hunger. Yet here, in the field of snow and frost, they faced a power beyond any battlefield maneuver, industrial, logistical, inexhaustible. And it was staring back at them, wrapped in wool coats and carried in mess tins. For the Americans, this was routine: fuel, food, heat, rhythm, order. For the German soldiers, every movement, every hiss of steam, every glint of metal, was an unfolding calculus of impossibility. They had been prepared for hardship, for cold, for hunger, for death. But not for this. not for the stark clarity of abundance that pressed upon their senses like the cold wind that whistled through the trees. As the afternoon sunlight waned, shadows stretching long and thin across the snow, the POWs shuffled back toward the line, hands empty, eyes wide. Their stomachs rumbled, but hunger was secondary to comprehension. They had seen the hidden weapon, the silent force behind the unstoppable tide. And for the first time, fear crept into their minds, unbidden, cold and insistent. The sun dipped behind the pines, leaving the camp in half-light, shadows crawling over the snow like spilled ink. German POWs huddled near the edge of the American perimeter, their boots sinking into slush and ice. Smoke from fires twisted against the darkening sky, carrying the acrid scent of fuel and fried meat, a silent testament to the machine of war they had just glimpsed. The forest seemed to lean inward, pressing in, carrying the echoes of distant gunfire that rattled the frozen branches. Riker and his squad moved among the men, distributing trays with mechanical precision. Every movement had weight, every gesture deliberate. The hiss of heaters punctuated the night, blending with the low growl of truck engines idling to keep generators warm. Each POW's gaze lingered on the steaming tins, the neatly packed rations, the chocolate bars wrapped like miniature treasures. Their mouths were dry, their hands frozen. They had survived the Ardennes on scraps, and yet here, warmth, nourishment, and methodical order stretched before them like an impassable wall. One of the Germans, a wiry corporal, crouched closer to inspect a crate of canned meat. His fingers trembled as he traced the embossed letters. The smell of preserved beef was alien, almost obscene after weeks of thin soups and stale bread. He looked around, uncertain whether to take, to flee, to protest. The snow underfoot creaked softly, a whisper of fragility, as though the ground itself feared disruption. Above, the skeletal trees groaned under frost, their branches sharp against the dim sky. The Americans continued their rhythm, a silent choreography of efficiency. One soldier hammered a metal stake into frozen ground, securing a top for windbreak. Another adjusted the small stoves, ensuring heat would be steady for the coming hours. The distant echo of artillery rolled across the hills, punctuated by the sharp rat-tat of machine gun fire. Each sound threaded into the night, layering tension over the surreal calm of the kitchen. The POWs began to move in small, cautious circles, drawn inexorably toward the heated meals. A younger soldier, barely 20, bent over a tray and inhaled deeply, eyes closing as if to internalize the scent. Around him, the other prisoners mirrored the action, the cold pressing their cheeks red, their hands shaking, yet the warmth of the food creating an almost unbearable contrast. They were caught between instinct and disbelief, hunger and awe, fear and comprehension. From the tree line, shadows shifted. The wind carried more than cold, it carried whispers of movement, of unseen patrols circling beyond the perimeter. The POWs stiffened, instinctively crouching lower, eyes flicking toward the dark. Every branch snapping under snow became a potential alarm, every distant crack of gunfire a prelude to engagement. Yet the ritual of American efficiency continued, indifferent to the tension. Cans opened, trays filled, heaters clicked into life. The forest watched silently, snow drifting like ash over the tableau. Corporal Riker moved to the largest crate, his gloved hands distributing fruit bars to a waiting soldier. The metal clanged, sparks briefly flashing as the tin lid struck the wooden crate. The POWs flinched. Some of them reached for the bars, hesitant, hands shaking. The youngest of them tore the wrapping slowly, inhaling the sharp sweetness of preserved fruit. He froze mid-bite, staring around as though expecting a trap to descend. The night pressed in, cold and silent, but for the hiss of heaters and the distant artillery, nothing moved. A sudden gust of wind whistled through the clearing, rattling the metal poles holding up the top. Snow blew in fine clouds, stinging exposed skin. The Americans barely flinched, continuing their methodical work. To the POWs, it seemed supernatural, the ability to ignore danger, to maintain order while war raged around them. Each tin opened, each scoop of stew lifted, became a lesson in industrial dominance, in the relentless machinery that supported an army capable of constant advance. Riker's squad began stacking empty tins for recycling, their movements rhythmic, almost hypnotic. The POW's eyes tracked each motion, their comprehension deepening with every click and clang. This was not mere cooking, this was war itself made manifest in sustenance, in heat, in order. They had trained to endure hardship, to fear bullets and frostbite, to survive on scraps. But this was a different caliber of warfare, invisible, logistical, unstoppable. The night deepened. The wind carried echoes of distant shells, punctuated by the faint hum of engines and the low murmur of soldiers' footsteps on snow. The POWs huddled closer together, shivering, silent, trying to reconcile what they had seen. The camp, bathed in the faint orange glow of stoves and lamps, looked surreal, a bastion of warmth and order in the frozen chaos. Every hiss of a heater, every clatter of a tray, became a pulse of revelation, a slow, heavy realization that they were witnessing a force far greater than any tank or rifle. Night had settled fully over the Ardennes. The tree line pressed dense and dark against the pale snow, branches sharp as skeletal fingers. The wind whispered through them, carrying the faint crackle of distant artillery and the echo of rolling tank treads over frozen mud. The American perimeter hummed quietly with life, stoves sizzling, heaters hissing, crates being shifted with meticulous care. The POWs crouched at the edge of the camp, eyes wide, stomachs tightening not just with hunger but with a growing understanding of the forces marshaled against them. Suddenly, a distant report shattered the stillness. The echo bounced across the hills, carrying the unmistakable cadence of German mortars. The POWs froze, instinctively pressed into the snow, their breath pluming in the frigid air. Their hands tightened around cold rifles, even though their orders forbade engagement. Inside the camp, the Americans reacted almost without thought. Soldiers ducked low, crates were secured, stoves carefully shifted behind makeshift barriers. The hiss of a heater became a low warning in the charged silence. Through the darkness, movement shimmered, a shadow among shadows. German patrols, probing, testing the perimeter. Their boots crunched against frozen snow, rifles clutched like lifelines. The POWs watched as the patrol approached the camp, tension etched in every line of their faces. They had survived ambushes, frostbite, starvation, but this organized, calm efficiency, felt almost like magic and terrifying. A low, metallic clatter rang out as a crate of rations tipped, sliding across the icy ground. One of the Americans lunged instinctively, stabilizing the contents before they spilled entirely. The POWs' hearts pounded in sync with the rhythmic beat of the soldiers' movements. Each step of the approaching Germans felt like a drum announcing doom. Snow sprayed from boots. A muted whistle of air passed overhead, a mortar shell slicing the darkness. The camp shook slightly, debris rattling against metal tables and crates, and for a heartbeat, the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Corporal Riker moved with calm precision, repositioning heaters behind sandbags, motioning soldiers to minimize exposure. The aroma of hot stew and coffee rose, almost mocking in its comfort, but no one had time to savor it. Every flash of movement from the tree line was measured, every distant echo catalogued. The faint clink of a helmet, the rustle of uniform against snow, the low groan of stressed metal in nearby trucks. The POWs hunched lower, sweat forming under layers of wool despite the bitter cold. They had witnessed abundance, now they were witnessing protection, the steel, strategy, and instinct that kept it alive under fire. A sharp crack split the air. Snow and ice flew as a bullet struck a crate near a soldier, ricocheting into the frost. A low curse, almost lost in the wind, escaped Riker. He gestured, and two men moved silently to provide cover for the hot rations, their boots barely making a sound against the ice. The POWs flinched at every clatter, every flash, their stomachs twisting with a combination of fear, awe, and involuntary hunger. From the tree line, more shadows advanced. The Germans were organized, systematic, cautious but relentless. They swept along the perimeter, checking the snow for tracks, inspecting the faint light of heaters. A patrol leader paused, noticing the faint steam from a cooking stove, signaling his men. The POWs' breaths caught. They had assumed this was only a quiet, orderly American encampment. Now it was a stage for tactical precision, every detail, every movement calibrated to survive under enemy scrutiny. Suddenly, a shell exploded in the far tree line. The snow erupted, hurling branches like shards of glass. A truck rocked from the concussion, spilling crates, but American soldiers reacted instantly, securing food and heat alike. The hiss of a displaced heater rose above the chaos. The POWs instinctively ducked, pressed into the snow as if hiding from a thunderstorm, hearts hammering. They had survived combat, hunger, frost, yet the interplay of motion, sound, and survival here felt overwhelming, a theater of controlled violence and order. As seconds stretched into a tense minute, Riker's team completed their protective formation around the rations. Soldiers moved like shadows, limbs synchronized, eyes scanning, senses sharpened to every whisper of the forest. The POWs watched the precision, unable to look away, stomachs aching for warmth and food while simultaneously understanding the machinery that protected it. Every hiss, every metallic clang, every muted shout carried significance. Life or death depended on the smallest detail. The shadows eventually receded, German patrols melting back into the trees, leaving the American perimeter intact. The POWs exhaled slowly, the tension uncoiling slightly, replaced by a deeper, quieter realization. They had seen the full spectrum of warfare behind the front lines, not just bullets and tanks, but the logistics, the foresight, the seamless orchestration that ensured survival. They had survived observation, learned the rhythm of the Americans' power, and yet the forest seemed to whisper, this was only the beginning. Riker returned to the stoves, hands steady despite the adrenaline, lifting a steaming tray for distribution. The POWs, still pressed against snow and ice, finally allowed themselves the smallest movements, a hand inching toward the warmth, an inhalation of the fragrant stew. The interplay of hunger and fear, of revelation and instinct, left them rigid, eyes tracing every motion, every glint of metal. They had witnessed abundance under fire. They had witnessed efficiency enforced by discipline. And for the first time, they comprehended that survival depended not only on courage but on the invisible machinery that supported it. As the night deepened, snow falling in silent sheets, the camp settled into a tense vigilance. Crates were rest-tacked, stoves adjusted, heaters clicked steadily against the cold. The forest was still. The POWs remained huddled, eyes wide, stomachs twisting, minds racing. They had survived the confrontation, but they understood now that American might was not in a single rifle, tank, or gun. It was in the relentless rhythm, the foresight, the invisible infrastructure that made every other effort fragile. The first wave of fear had passed. But the lesson lingered, heavy and persistent. Abundance under fire was a weapon as lethal as any shell, and no one, not even the proudest German soldier, could afford to underestimate it. Dawn broke over the Ardennes, pale and brittle, the horizon a jagged line of grey light cutting through frost-laden branches. The American camp lay quiet, the hissing of heaters the only sound above the crunch of boots and faint scuttle of snow falling from trees. The battlefield beyond was distant now, but its echoes lingered in the air, the faint metallic tang of spent shells, the acrid residue of engines and gunfire, and the heavy, almost tangible tension that had gripped the night. The POWs stirred, bodies stiff from hours of crouching in snow and ice, eyes wide and scanning the perimeter. The darkness had passed, but the lesson remained. Hunger pressed against their stomachs, but it was tempered by awe, by the almost painful recognition of order and abundance as a weapon. Crates of food, once mere metal and paper, had become symbols of an industrial might they could not deny. One soldier lifted a steaming tin of stew, the warmth seeping through gloves and into frozen fingers. He inhaled, eyes tracing the disciplined movements of American soldiers still arranging supplies, and understood, with a quiet dread, that they had been witness to something larger than the battlefield itself. The camp buzzed with routine now, but the precision was relentless. Soldiers moved with disciplined purpose, arranging heaters, stacking crates, checking rations against manifest sheets, their movements economical but unbroken. Engines hummed, radios crackled softly, and somewhere, a truck shifted on its frozen axle. The POWs observed in silence, shadows against the pale light, recognizing that every action, every small adjustment, was calculated to maintain the rhythm that had protected the camp through the night's probe. One POW, the wiry corporal who had first examined the disposable heaters, knelt beside a crate and traced the embossed markings, hands trembling. He understood now why survival had seemed effortless to the Americans. Every ration, every heater, every cup of coffee was part of a machine designed to sustain, protect, and push forward. Hunger and cold, once insurmountable, had been neutralized by foresight and relentless organization. His chest tightened as he realized the scale of what they were facing, not just men, but infrastructure, logistics, and unyielding discipline, all intertwined. Riker moved past them, distributing breakfast with the same mechanical efficiency that had defined the night. The POWs watched as hot stew filled tins, chocolate was handed out, and coffee steamed into waiting cups. Each hiss of the heaters, each metallic clang of a tray, carried a weight beyond the immediate. It was proof of a system that turned simple sustenance into an instrument of war. The young soldier hesitated before taking a bar of dried fruit, savoring its sweet tang, the sensation almost surreal against the backdrop of snow and frost. The forest was still, but its silence was no longer comforting. The POWs could sense the power of the army they had glimpsed, the unbroken cycle of preparation, protection, and nourishment that enabled men to fight, endure, and survive where others would falter. Hunger, exhaustion, frostbite, all had been mitigated by an invisible force of planning and resources. They understood now that the front lines were more than trenches, guns, and tanks. They were arteries of logistics and industrial might that flowed unseen yet unstoppable. Beyond the immediate perimeter, the Ardennes stretched silent and cold, dotted with the faint traces of artillery and frozen footprints. The POWs lingered near the edge of the camp, observing the Americans dismantle temporary barriers, shift crates, and move with unbroken rhythm. Each movement was deliberate, economical, a choreography of survival and power. They had expected weakness, scarcity, and exhaustion. Instead, they had witnessed abundance, order, and resilience, and they would carry the memory with them, heavy as frost, for the rest of their lives. Riker, finishing his rounds, paused briefly to glance back at the POWs. There was no fear in his eyes, only the quiet gravity of routine. The men accepted their place within the rhythm, a rhythm that had carried them through darkness, artillery, and shadowed threats. For the Germans, the lesson was inescapable. The might of an army was not solely in its weapons but in its ability to sustain, to endure, and to project relentless order even under fire. As morning light strengthened, the camp seemed almost serene, snow glinting cold and bright, smoke rising in lazy spirals from stoves, heaters hissing gently against the chill. Yet beneath the calm, the POWs felt the weight of understanding settle upon them, a quiet dread that was both revelation and resignation. They had survived the night, but they had seen the machinery that made survival and victory almost inevitable for the Americans. The forest held its frozen silence. Crates were stacked, trays cleared, heaters extinguished. The wind shifted, carrying the faint tang of metal, coffee, and stew into the stillness. The POWs, shivering and hungry, rose from the snow and trudged back toward their temporary holding, their minds heavy with comprehension. They had glimpsed the invisible weapon, not a gun, not a tank, but sustenance, order, and relentless preparation. And as the first true sunlight of the Ardennes winter touched the camp, falling on frozen metal and steaming rations alike, the stark, immutable truth lingered in the air. Abundance, carefully managed, under fire, was a force that could break morale, shatter assumptions, and change the course of battle. The Germans had seen it, and they would never forget. The snow fell quietly over the Ardennes, indifferent, as though the world itself had paused to bear witness to the lesson.